A therapy dog, in an act of misunderstood fury, pulls an autistic child away in an isolated country house. The alarmed father tries to restrain him, unaware that the animal is about to reveal a deadly and invisible danger. The air in the country house, which moments before was just ochre and dusty, now felt dense, heavy with an invisible tension. Daniel gripped Max's leash tightly, his knuckles white against the leather, as the golden Labrador pulled with a ferocity he had never seen before. Max wasn't just restless, he was in a panic that radiated from him like heat waves. "Max, stop! What's wrong with you?" Daniel hissed, his voice hoarse with frustration and alarm. Leo, Daniel's son, was a few steps away, still near the corner from where Max had torn him. The boy, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, or perhaps processing it in his own unique way, merely watched Max with distant curiosity, his eyes fixed on the dog's open mouth, from which low, guttural growls emerged. Max, however, completely ignored Daniel's commands. His muscles were tense, every fiber of his body seemed to vibrate with uncontrolled energy. He wasn't trying to bite or attack. Instead, he was pulling, not away from the house, but towards the wall, more specifically, towards the area where an old oil painting, a faded portrait of an unknown woman, hung crookedly. The dog scratched the wooden floor with his hind paws, struggling against Daniel's grip, his eyes fixed on the wall with an almost manic intensity. "Max, that's enough. You'll scare Leo." Daniel tried again, pulling harder. He was starting to sweat. Max's behavior was completely atypical. The therapy dog, trained to be a pillar of calm and support, was acting like a cornered wild animal. Daniel felt a pang of anger mixed with worry. Was it some illness, a seizure? But Max wouldn't give in. He let out a sharp bark, a sound that made Leo flinch slightly, and lunged with one last desperate pull. Daniel, caught off guard by the sudden force, lost his balance for an instant. The leash slipped a little in his hand, and Max seized the opportunity, charging against the wall with surprising momentum. The impact was dull and powerful. The painting, which was already precariously hung, swung violently. The rusty hook that held it to the wall creaked and, with a snap that echoed in the tense silence of the room, gave way. The portrait of the unknown woman plummeted, hitting the wooden floor with a thud and shattering into pieces. For a moment, there was only the sound of shattered glass and Daniel's gasping. He looked at the broken painting, then at Max, who was now panting but strangely calm, his eyes still fixed on the empty space on the wall. And then Daniel saw, from the hole revealed in the wall, where the painting had hung for decades, a thin, treacherous column of grey smoke began to snake. It was an almost imperceptible wisp at first, dancing in the air, but quickly grew thicker, darker, carrying with it a pungent and unmistakable smell. The smell of burning wood, of melted electrical insulation, of danger. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. A fire, silent, invisible, creeping through the walls of the isolated country house. Max wasn't furious. He was desperate. He wasn't trying to hurt Leo. He was trying to save him. Terror chilled Daniel's veins. The smoke, once a mere wisp, now spread into a subtle veil, filling the space where Leo stood. The child, still oblivious, began to cough lightly. A sound that tore through the silence and terrified Daniel more than any of Max's growls. "Leo!" Daniel cried out, his voice choked with panic, his eyes fixed on the rising smoke, revealing the deadly threat that had been hidden in plain sight, and which Max, his therapy dog, had risked everything to expose. Daniel's world narrowed to a single point, the tendrils of smoke curling around his son. The scream tore from his throat, raw and instinctive. Every fiber of his being screamed for action. He didn't think. He acted. Dropping Max's leash, who now stood strangely still, watching the smoke with a tense quietness, Daniel leaped, covering the distance to Leo in a blink of an eye. "Leo, my son, come with me!" he exclaimed, his voice failing. He grabbed the boy, who was still standing, eyes wide, but without the panic Daniel felt. Leo coughed again, a small, dry sound that pierced Daniel's heart. The smoke, once a wisp, now spread into a subtle veil, filling the space. The pungent, suffocating smell of burning wood and melting plastic invaded his nostrils, burning his throat. Daniel lifted Leo into his arms, the boy light and fragile against his chest. "It's okay, Leo. Daddy's here," he murmured, more to himself than to his son, as he turned Leo's face away from the rising smoke. Leo's eyes, for a brief moment, met Daniel's, and there was an innocent confusion in them, a lack of understanding of the imminent catastrophe. Max, the previously furious dog, now stood by Daniel's side, no longer pulling or growling, but with a protective stance. He looked at Daniel, then at the living room door, and let out a low bark, almost a warning, a call. It was as if he was saying, "This way, quick!" Daniel's mind spun in a dizzying mix of guilt and gratitude. Max, his therapy dog, the animal he had reprimanded, almost assaulted. Max wasn't crazy, he was a hero. He had seen what Daniel, in his blindness and frustration, had failed to notice. The fire, silent, treacherous, consuming the house from within. That corner, where Leo liked to retreat, was the epicenter. If Max hadn't acted... The thought was an icy dagger in Daniel's chest. "Let's go, Max," Daniel ordered, his voice firmer now, propelled by adrenaline and the instinct for survival. He turned, with Leo in his arms, and began to move quickly towards the living room door, the only visible exit. The smoke was growing denser, transforming the ochre air into a grey haze that obscured the edges of the room. Every breath was an effort, every step a race against time. The smell of smoke was oppressive now, permeating their clothes, their hair, Leo's skin. Daniel felt the subtle heat emanating from the wall where the painting had fallen, a heat that hadn't been there moments before, a heat that promised flames soon. He needed to get out. Now. "Don't look back, Leo," Daniel whispered, clutching his son close. He tried to cover Leo's mouth and nose with his free hand, but it was hard to maintain their pace. Max was a step ahead, clearing the way, his eyes fixed on the door, like a loyal guide. As he passed the living room entrance, Daniel glanced back for a brief instant. The flames weren't visible yet, but smoke poured from the hole in the wall with alarming force, spreading rapidly across the ceiling like a dark, living stain. The sound of a muffled crackle coming from inside the wall confirmed his worst fears. The fire was spreading. He ran down the narrow hallway, his feet pounding on the wooden floor. The house, once a peaceful refuge, now felt like a death trap. The front door, it was the only thought in his mind. "Almost there, boy, almost there," he gasped, his heart pounding wildly. Max, with his agility, was already at the front door, scratching at it with his paws, barking with urgency. Daniel reached the doorknob, feeling sweat trickle down his forehead, mixed with dread. With each passing second, the smoke seemed to swallow more and more of the space behind them. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe. With a desperate pull, Daniel flung the door open. The fresh afternoon air rushed into the house, a momentary relief, but also a reminder of the threat they were leaving behind. He didn't hesitate, pushing the door outward and running onto the lawn, Max by his side. Leo still firmly clutched in his arms. He didn't stop until he was a safe distance from the house, in the middle of the lawn, under the blue, indifferent sky. The clean air filled his lungs, but the smell of smoke still clung to his clothes, in his mind. He looked back. From the isolated country house, which looked so peaceful from the outside, a thin column of grey smoke was already beginning to rise from the roof, a silent and terrible sign of the destruction unfolding within. Daniel hugged Leo tightly, feeling the small body tremble slightly against his. Max nestled at his feet, panting, but with a look of relief and vigilance. The house was on fire, and they were alive because of a dog he had misjudged. Terror still consumed him. But an overwhelming wave of gratitude and love for Max flooded him. They were out, but the fight was far from over. What would they do now? The house, their only refuge, was becoming a funeral pyre. Quick, Max, the fire. He needed to get out. Now, the front door. He looked back. The house was on fire. What would they do now? Daniel knelt on the damp lawn, still holding Leo firmly. The smell of smoke was a persistent veil, but the fresh afternoon air was a balm for his burning lungs. Leo was quiet, his face nestled in Daniel's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the smoke that was now growing denser and darker, spiraling up from the roof. There was no panic in the boy's eyes, just a silent, almost hypnotized observation. It was Leo's typical reaction to intense events, an internal absorption, a processing that Daniel knew would take time to manifest. Max, exhausted, lay down at Daniel's feet, his tongue hanging out, panting, but his amber eyes didn't stray from the burning house. There was a silent dignity in the dog, a vigilance Daniel had never noticed before. "Max," Daniel whispered. His voice choked with emotion and the smoke that still scratched his throat. He reached out his free hand and stroked the dog's head, a gesture of gratitude that seemed too small for what Max had done. The dog responded with a slight wag of his tail, a silent acknowledgement. The sound of crackling and groaning from the burning wood began to intensify, overlaying the afternoon silence. The flames, previously invisible, now danced behind the downstairs windows, casting trembling orange shadows. The house, which had been his family's sanctuary, the place where he and Leo had tried to rebuild their lives after Sarah's loss, was being devoured. "My God," Daniel murmured, the realization hitting him with overwhelming weight. They had lost everything. Sarah's photos, Leo's drawings, the memories, the few belongings left from their previous life. Everything was in there, turning to ashes. Despair threatened to swallow him, but Leo's presence in his arms anchored him. He had to be strong. For Leo. He took his cell phone from his pocket, his hands trembling. The screen lit up, but the signal bar was empty. Nothing. The country house was too isolated. "No, no, no," he cursed, slapping the device against his palm. Frustration was a punch to the gut. How would he call for help? How would he warn anyone? Leo coughed again, a dry hack that brought Daniel back to reality. "It's okay, son," he said, kissing the boy's head. "Daddy will figure something out." He knew Leo didn't understand the words, but perhaps he felt the intention, the security in his embrace. Daniel stood up, Leo still in his arms, and looked around. The dirt road leading to the house was long and deserted. The nearest town was kilometers away. There were no neighbors, no cars passing. They were alone. "Max, we need to go," Daniel said, his voice firmer now, with a renewed tone of urgency. "We need help." He started walking towards the road, the only possible direction. Max got up and followed him closely, a faithful guardian. As he walked away, Daniel couldn't help but cast one last look at the house. Flames were already licking the roof, and a thick cloud of black smoke rose into the blue sky, a somber beacon of their tragedy. The heat could be felt even at that distance, a cruel reminder of what they had narrowly escaped. Guilt hit him again, stronger than ever. He had doubted Max, had thought the dog was crazy, that he was a threat to Leo. He had been blind, selfish in his own pain and frustration. Max wasn't just a therapy dog. He was a guardian angel, a savior. Without him, Leo would be. Daniel couldn't finish the thought. The knot in his throat tightened. "Thank you, Max," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. The dog looked at him, his eyes expressing a deep understanding. The dirt road was uneven under his feet, and Daniel felt Leo's weight, but adrenaline propelled him. Every step was an escape, a desperate search for safety and an uncertain future. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple, colors that contrasted cruelly with the dark smoke still rising from the burning house. Night was approaching, and with it the cold and the darkness. They were without shelter, without communication, and with a long road ahead. The struggle for survival was just beginning. The dirt road, once merely a path to refuge, now stretched before Daniel as a promise of an uncertain future and, at the same time, an insurmountable barrier. Every step was heavy, not just from Leo's body in his arms, but from the burden of loss and responsibility. The sun, which had previously bathed the landscape in golden hues, now rapidly dipped, painting the sky with strokes of orange and purple that seemed to mock the approaching darkness. "Almost there, Leo," Daniel murmured. Though he knew there was a non-existent place, with each glance back, the column of smoke from the house seemed taller, darker, a monument to their shattered life. The smell of burning wood still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the tragedy. Leo surprisingly remained calm, his face nestled in Daniel's shoulder. His eyes, which Daniel couldn't see, were probably fixed on some detail of the passing world, or perhaps on nothing, immersed in his own universe. It was Leo's calm that worried Daniel most. The lack of reaction was a sign that the trauma was being processed in a way he couldn't reach. Max, the silent hero, trotted faithfully beside Daniel, his tongue hanging out, but with an energy that seemed inexhaustible. His eyes, once full of protective fury, now carried an expression of loyalty and weariness. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "You saved us, boy," he whispered to the dog, who responded with a slight wag of his tail, as if understanding the depth of the gratitude. The road was uneven, full of loose stones and potholes. Daniel felt his leg muscles burn and his arms begin to ache from Leo's weight. He needed a plan, but his mind was a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts. Where to go, who to look for? The nearest town was a distant speck on the map, and without communication it seemed unattainable. "Dad, cold," Leo suddenly said, his voice small and muffled against Daniel's shoulder. It was the first time Leo had spoken since they left the house. Daniel felt a shiver. The sun had already completely disappeared, and the night air was starting to bite. He was wearing only a t-shirt and jeans, and Leo, though in his arms, also didn't have enough warm clothing. "I know, son. Daddy will figure something out," Daniel replied, trying to infuse confidence into his voice, but panic was beginning to set in. He looked around. The road was flanked by tall, dense trees, forming a dark wall against the starry sky that was beginning to appear. There were no lights, no signs of civilization. The solitude was overwhelming. He stopped for a moment, gasping, and gently placed Leo on the ground. The boy stumbled a little, but remained standing, looking at the growing darkness with the same silent curiosity. Daniel, hesitant, took off his own t-shirt and wrapped it around Leo, covering his shoulders. "Better?" he asked. Leo merely nodded, his eyes fixed on Max, who approached and sniffed the boy. "We can't stop," Daniel told himself, the cold already biting him. He picked up Leo again, the boy's body seeming even more fragile now. "We need to find help. We need to find someone." They continued to walk. The sound of their footsteps on the loose earth was the only noise, besides Max's panting and Daniel's own heartbeats. With each passing minute, the darkness deepened, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch and writhe, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and menacing. Daniel felt a chill that came not just from the cold, but from fear. He tried to remember the last time he had seen a car pass on that road. Days, weeks. The country house was known for its isolation. That had been its advantage, what made it a refuge. Now it was its curse. Suddenly, Max stopped, his ears alert, and let out a low, almost inaudible growl. Daniel stopped too, his heart pounding. "What is it, Max?" he whispered, clutching Leo closer. The dog didn't respond. merely fixed his eyes on the darkness ahead, a strange glint in his gaze. Daniel tried to peer into the night, but he couldn't see anything beyond the indistinct shapes of the trees. The air grew denser, and a new smell, different from the smoke, reached his nostrils, a wild, earthy scent. Max growled again, louder this time, and took a step forward, assuming a protective stance. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. They weren't alone in the darkness. The struggle for survival, he realized, with a chilling dread, was about to become much more complex and dangerous than he had imagined. The cold dread that seized Daniel was more than the icy night air. It was the certainty that the darkness ahead held something. Max, once a docile therapy dog, was now a vigilant beast. His muscles tense beneath his fur, a guttural growl vibrating in his chest. Daniel clutched Leo even tighter, his son's small body trembling slightly against his. "What is it, Max?" he repeated, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. His eyes tried to pierce the curtain of shadows, but the night was an impenetrable veil. The wild scent intensified, mixing with the lingering aroma of smoke and damp earth. It was an animal smell, of the forest, but with an intensity Daniel couldn't identify. A branch snapped in the woods to the right, a dry, crisp sound that reverberated in the oppressive silence. Max took another step forward, his growl rising, and his amber eyes gleamed with a ferocity Daniel had never seen. "Stay behind me, Max," Daniel ordered, his voice firmer than he felt. He took a step back, turning to place Leo behind him, using his own body as a shield. Panic threatened to swallow him. They were exhausted, without food, without water, and now apparently at the mercy of some wild creature. The irony was cruel, escaping fire only to fall into the clutches of untamed nature. Leo, who until then had been strangely calm, began to stir in Daniel's arms. "Noise," he mumbled, his voice muffled. Daniel felt his heart clench. Leo's sensory overload was a constant concern, and now, in the midst of danger, he feared the boy would collapse. "It's okay, son. Daddy's here," he tried to reassure him, kissing his son's forehead. Max, however, didn't seem willing to back down. He advanced a few more centimeters, his body low and ready to attack, his teeth bared in a silent warning. Daniel felt a renewed respect for the dog. Max wasn't just a protector, he was a warrior. Then a shadow moved among the trees, larger than Daniel expected. It wasn't a coyote or a fox. It was large, with eyes that reflected the faint starlight. A wolf? A bear? Daniel's mind spun for answers, but fear clouded his logic. "Max, no!" Daniel hissed, trying to pull the dog back, but Max was determined. The dog let out a furious bark, a sound that tore through the night silence and made the creature in the forest momentarily retreat. Daniel seized the chance. "Run, Max, run!" He began to move, not forward on the road, but to the side, towards the woods, seeking an escape route. It was a desperate decision, but the open road seemed like a trap. The trees, though dark and treacherous, offered some cover. He stumbled over roots and stones, Leo's weight unbalancing him. Max, surprisingly, didn't follow him immediately. He remained on the road, barking and growling at the shadow moving in the forest, keeping it at bay, giving Daniel precious seconds. "Max, come!" Daniel cried out, his voice choked with urgency. The dog, after one last defiant bark, turned and ran to catch up with Daniel, who was already plunging into the darkness of the forest. The air there was colder, damper, and the smell of earth and wet leaves was strong. Daniel could hear the rustling of leaves behind them, the sound of the creature following them. "Dad, scared," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. Daniel felt a pang of pain. He had promised safety, and now he was dragging his son into even greater danger. "Don't be scared, son. Daddy's here. Max is here," he repeated, more to himself than to Leo. They ran. Daniel with Leo in his arms, Max by his side, an agile shadow in the darkness. The forest was a labyrinth of trees and bushes, and Daniel felt branches scratching his clothes and skin. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away from the road and that creature. Suddenly the forest opened slightly, revealing a small, rocky clearing. In the center, there was a rock formation that seemed to offer minimal shelter. Daniel ran towards it, his breath coming in gasps, his lungs burning. He squeezed behind the rocks, trying to hide. Max followed him, panting, and positioned himself in front, his eyes fixed on the darkness from where they had come. The sound of the pursuit diminished, but didn't disappear. Daniel could hear the rustling of leaves. The wild scent still lingered in the air. The creature was nearby, circling. Leo, in Daniel's arms, was trembling uncontrollably. Daniel hugged him tightly, trying to transfer his warmth. He looked at Max, who remained motionless, a statue of loyalty and courage. "You're incredible, Max," Daniel whispered, gratitude almost suffocating him. The night was a heavy cloak, and the cold intensified. They were trapped, surrounded by darkness and an invisible predator. Daniel felt despair return, stronger than ever. How would they get out of this? How would he protect Leo? The burning house seemed like a smaller problem now. The struggle for survival had indeed become much more complex. He had to think, had to find a way out. But his mind was blank, dominated by fear and exhaustion. "It's okay, son. A wolf? A bear? Run, Max! Run!" He began to move, not forward on the road, but to the side, towards the woods, seeking an escape route. "Don't be scared, son. Daddy's here. How would they get out of this? How would he protect Leo?" The silence in the clearing was heavy, broken only by Daniel's and Max's gasping breaths and Leo's muffled sobs. Daniel felt his son's body stiffen in his arms. "Leo, it's okay, my love," he murmured, stroking the boy's soft hair. But it wasn't okay. He could feel the creature's gaze on them, even without seeing it. It was a visceral, primitive sensation. Max, head low and body tense, let out an almost inaudible growl, a silent warning. Daniel realized the dog was exhausted too, but his determination didn't waver. "We need a plan," Daniel thought, his mind struggling to process the situation. The rock formation offered temporary shelter, but it wasn't a fortress. If the creature decided to attack, they would be at a disadvantage. He looked at the sky, seeking some guidance. The stars shone coldly, indifferent to his despair. There was no moon. The darkness was almost absolute. Suddenly, a sound. It wasn't a breaking branch, but a soft scratch, almost a whisper, coming from behind the rocks. Daniel froze. The creature was approaching from behind, or perhaps it was just circling, testing their defenses. Max turned his head slightly, his eyes fixed in the direction of the sound, the growl in his chest intensifying. "Dad, cold," Leo repeated, his voice now a whimper. Daniel felt his son's body tremble harder, the cold, the darkness, the fear. Everything was accumulating in Leo. Daniel took off his own jacket, which he had used to protect himself from the cold before giving his t-shirt to Leo, and wrapped it around the boy, clutching him even tighter. "I'm here, Leo. Daddy's here." A new scent, stronger and more pungent, invaded his nostrils. It was the creature's smell, now much closer. Daniel felt his blood run cold. He couldn't hide anymore. He had to act. But what? He had no weapons, nowhere to go. The forest was a labyrinth, and the road a danger. His eyes swept the clearing, looking for anything, any idea. He saw a fallen branch, thick and heavy, a few meters away. It was a chance, a minimal chance, but it was all he had. "Max," Daniel whispered, his voice tense, "keep an eye on Leo." He began to move slowly, trying not to make a sound, to get the branch. Every muscle in his body protested, but adrenaline propelled him. He could feel the creature's eyes on him, the tension in the air almost palpable. Max remained motionless, a protective barrier between Leo and the invisible danger. Daniel reached the branch, his fingers gripping the rough wood. It was heavier than he expected, but it offered a sense of security. He lifted it, feeling a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. At the same instant, a pair of gleaming eyes emerged from the darkness, not a few meters away, but mere centimeters from where Max stood. The creature had approached silently, using the darkness as its cloak. It was large, furry, with sharp teeth that gleamed faintly. A wolf, Daniel realized with a shock. A hungry wolf. Max let out a furious bark, a sound of pure defiance, and lunged forward. Daniel screamed, "Max, no!" But it was too late. The therapy dog, the silent hero, was about to face the forest predator, and Daniel knew that his family's fate depended on the outcome of that unequal fight. Max's furious bark was cut short by a guttural growl, deeper and wilder, that made the air vibrate. The clearing exploded in a chaos of sounds and movements. Daniel saw only blurs, an indistinct mass of fur and fury, as Max and the wolf clashed. The sound of teeth clashing, claws scratching, bodies struggling, filled the night. It was a brutal symphony of survival. "Max!" Daniel cried out, the dog's name choked in his throat. He didn't hesitate. With the heavy branch in his hands, he advanced, the instinct to protect Max, overriding his paralyzing fear. Leo, in his arms, let out a sharp scream, a sound of pure terror that cut Daniel to the heart. The boy writhed, his hands covering his ears, his sobs intensifying. The fight was fierce and swift. The wolf, larger and wilder, tried to bite Max's neck, but the therapy dog was surprisingly agile. He dodged, barked, and tried to bite the predator's paws, his movements calculated, despite the apparent ferocity. Daniel approached, the branch raised, looking for an opening. The smell of wild animal, of sweat and blood, or the promise of it, was overwhelming. He saw the wolf rise over Max for an instant, its fangs bared, ready for the final blow. Without thinking, Daniel swung the branch with all the strength he had left, aiming for the wolf's flank. The impact was dull, a heavy thud that reverberated through his arms. The wolf let out a howl of pain and surprise, staggering sideways, breaking off the attack. Max seized the distraction. With renewed barking, he lunged again, biting the wolf's hind leg. The predator, wounded and disoriented, retreated a few steps, its eyes gleaming with a mixture of pain and rage. It looked at Daniel, then at Max, assessing the threat. The hunt wasn't going as expected. The wolf let out a low growl, a warning, and then, with one last look at the group, turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest, a silent blur that merged with the shadows. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the noise of the fight. Daniel remained motionless, the branch still raised, his breath coming in gasps, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He waited, tense, for any sign of the wolf's return. But the forest remained silent, only the distant rustling of leaves indicating that the creature was moving away. Slowly, Daniel lowered the branch. Feeling the weight of exhaustion take over his body, he looked at Max. The dog was panting, his fur bristling, but he seemed unharmed. There was no visible blood, just the tension of a body that had just fought for its life. Max approached Daniel, leaning his head against his leg, a gesture of loyalty and relief. Daniel knelt, hugging the dog tightly, gratitude overflowing. "You're a hero, Max," he whispered, his voice choked. "A true hero." Then he remembered Leo. The boy was huddled in his arms, trembling uncontrollably, his eyes tightly shut, his hands still covering his ears. The sharp scream had turned into muffled crying, a whimper that tore at Daniel's soul. "Leo, my love, it's over," Daniel murmured, rocking him gently. "The wolf is gone. It's okay." But Leo didn't respond. He was in a state of sensory overload, his body rigid, his mind trapped in his own world of panic. Daniel felt an even greater chill. He had saved Leo from the fire, Max had saved him from the wolf, but now, what would he do with his son? He clutched him against his chest, trying to transmit warmth and security. "Daddy's here, Leo. Daddy's here." The clearing was dark and cold. The danger from the wolf had passed, but they were still lost, exhausted, and without hope. Adrenaline began to subside, leaving Daniel with a sense of emptiness and despair. He looked at Max, who now sat beside him, vigilant but also exhausted. "What do we do now, boy?" Daniel asked the dog, his voice hoarse. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence of the forest. The struggle for survival had become even more brutal. They had faced fire, darkness, cold, and a wild predator. And now, Leo was in collapse, and Daniel had no idea where to go or what to do. The night seemed endless, and with each passing minute, hope diminished. He needed a plan, but his mind was in tatters. The only certainty was that he couldn't give up. Not for Leo, not for Max. The silence that followed the wolf's departure was an almost unbearable weight. Daniel remained kneeling, the heavy branch still in his hands, his body trembling not just from cold, but from an exhaustion that seemed to drain his very soul. The smell of damp earth, of dry leaves, and subtly of the wild animal still lingered in the air, a chilling reminder of the danger that had just passed. Max, panting, leaned against him, a welcome warmth and a comforting presence. Daniel stroked the dog's fur, feeling the tension in his muscles, his heavy breathing. "You were incredible, boy," he repeated, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. But gratitude and relief were quickly replaced by a new wave of panic as he looked at Leo. The boy was huddled in his arms, his eyes still tightly shut, his body rigid. The muffled crying had diminished to an almost inaudible whimper, a sound Daniel recognized with growing terror. It wasn't just fear, it was the sound of Leo withdrawing, losing himself in his own world. "Leo, my love, it's okay," Daniel murmured, rocking him gently. "The wolf is gone, Daddy's here, Max is here." He tried to open his son's eyes, but the eyelids remained firmly closed. He tried to make him drink some water from the bottle he still carried, but Leo didn't react, his mouth sealed. The boy's body was cold, despite Daniel's jacket and the t-shirt he had given him. The cold sweat on Leo's forehead was a sign of his internal suffering. He had faced fire. He had fought a wild predator. But now, confronted with his son's frightening stillness, he felt completely powerless. It was a different kind of danger, one he couldn't fight with a branch or brute force. Leo needed warmth, safety, a calm environment. He needed medical help. And they were in the middle of nowhere, lost in the darkness and the cold. "What do I do, Max?" Daniel asked the dog, his voice choked. Max merely tilted his head, his eyes fixed on Leo, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. The dog let out a small whine, a sound of concern. Daniel looked around, desperate. The rock formation was no longer a shelter. It was a trap. Staying put meant freezing, and Leo needed movement, warmth. But where to go? The forest was a dark labyrinth. He had no idea which direction to follow to find the road or any sign of civilization. Daniel's mind was in tatters, but a single certainty persisted. He couldn't give up. Not for Leo, not for Max. He had to try. He had to find a way out. As he tried to calm Leo, rocking him and whispering words of comfort, a distant faint sound reached his ears. It was almost inaudible, a tenuous hum that could be the wind, or perhaps an engine. Daniel held his breath, forcing himself to listen through the accelerated beating of his own heart. The sound repeated, a little clearer this time, a distant echo of something mechanical. It was too faint to be a rescue siren, but it was a sound of civilization. A road, a car, no matter what it was a direction, a chance. "Max," Daniel whispered, his voice filled with a new, albeit fragile hope. "Did you hear that?" The dog raised his ears, turning his head in the direction of the sound, a low growl in his chest indicating that he too had noticed. Daniel stood up with difficulty. Leo still rigidly clutched to him. The heavy branch was discarded, now an unnecessary burden. He needed all his strength to carry Leo. The boy was a dead weight, but Daniel pressed him against his chest, trying to infuse him with his own warmth and determination. "Let's go, boy," Daniel said to Max, pointing in the direction of the sound. "We need to go that way." Every step was torture. The forest floor was uneven, covered with roots and stones hidden by the darkness. Daniel stumbled but refused to fall. Leo, in his arms, remained motionless, a constant reminder of the urgency of his mission. Max went ahead, sniffing the way, his eyes gleaming in the darkness, a faithful and silent guide. The distant hum seemed to alternately approach and recede, toying with Daniel's hope. He didn't know if he was going in the right direction, if the sound was real or just an illusion created by his exhausted mind. But it was the only thing he had, the only light at the end of a tunnel that seemed endless. With each step, the cold intensified, the darkness seemed denser. Daniel felt Leo's body grow even colder, and despair threatened to swallow him again. But he looked at Max, who pressed on with unwavering determination, and at Leo, who, despite his unresponsiveness, was still there, needing him. He couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. The struggle for survival had become a desperate march against time, against the cold, against the darkness, and against his son's own mind. The distant hum, almost inaudible at first, was the only thing preventing Daniel from collapsing right there in the oppressive darkness. He had forced himself to listen, to hold his breath, to ignore the frantic pounding in his ears. And then he heard it again, a little clearer, a mechanical sound that seemed to defy the silent vastness of the forest. It wasn't a wolf's howl, nor the rustling of leaves. It was something from another world, a world he had left behind. "Max," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and a new, albeit fragile, hope. "Did you hear that?" The dog raised his ears, turning his head in the direction of the sound. A low, guttural growl in his chest confirmed. Max had noticed it too. It wasn't an illusion. It was real. Daniel stood up with difficulty, his aching body protesting with every movement. Leo, still rigidly clutched to him, was a dead weight, but Daniel pressed him against his chest, trying to infuse him with his own warmth and determination. The heavy branch, which had once been his only weapon, was discarded, now an unnecessary burden. He needed all his strength to carry his son. "We need to go that way." The forest floor was uneven, covered with roots and stones hidden by the impenetrable darkness. Each time his knees buckled, the image of Leo's pale face, motionless in his arms, propelled him forward. The boy was a burden, but also his anchor, the reason to continue. He seemed to feel the urgency, the need for haste. He didn't know if he was going in the right direction, if the sound was real, or just an illusion created by his exhausted mind, desperate for any sign of salvation. With each step, the cold intensified, the darkness seemed denser, swallowing any remnant of light. The fear that Leo wouldn't make it, that he would be lost forever in that state of overload, was a constant torment. He looked at Max, who pressed on with unwavering determination, and at Leo, who, despite his unresponsiveness, was still there, needing him. He couldn't stop, he couldn't give up. His muscles burned, his lungs ached, but he kept going. One step after another, propelled by a strength he didn't know he possessed. Suddenly, the sound became clearer, unmistakable. It was no longer a hum, but the steady rumble of an engine, accompanied by a faint, intermittent glow through the trees. A light, an artificial light. "Max!" Daniel gasped, a cry of relief and exhaustion. The dog quickened his pace, a low, hopeful bark escaping his throat. Daniel followed, renewed adrenaline giving him one last push. The trees began to thin, and the light grew stronger, more constant. It wasn't a main road, but a beaten dirt track, and at its end, a vehicle. An old pickup truck with its headlights on, parked beside a small rustic cabin. A man stood beside the pickup truck, tinkering with something in the engine. The light from a headlamp illuminating his work. He seemed to be having trouble. Daniel stumbled out of the forest, staggering onto the track. Leo still clutched tightly in his arms. The man looked up, startled by the noise, his headlamp pointing directly at them. His eyes widened as he saw Daniel's exhausted, dirty figure, the dog by his side, and the inert child in his arms. "Help!" Daniel managed to murmur, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. "Please help!" The man, an elderly person with a grey beard and tired eyes, lowered his headlamp and ran towards them, his expression of surprise quickly turning to concern. "My God, what happened to you?" he asked, his voice deep and full of astonishment. "Are you hurt? And the boy?" Daniel felt his legs give way. He had arrived. He had made it. The relief was so overwhelming that the world began to spin. He tried to speak again, but the words were lost in a tangle of sounds. The darkness of the forest seemed to recede, but the darkness in his mind threatened to swallow him. He felt the ground dangerously close. "The boy. Leo," Daniel managed to say before exhaustion finally overcame him. Max, with an urgent whine, nudged Daniel's shoulder, trying to keep him upright, but it was too late. Daniel collapsed, falling to his knees, but protecting Leo until the last instant. The man ran to support them, taking Leo from Daniel's arms before he hit the ground. Max barked, desperate, as Daniel finally surrendered to unconsciousness. The last image in his mind being the stranger's worried face and the certainty that, finally, they were safe. The old man, whose name Daniel still didn't know, acted with surprising speed for his age. He carefully supported Leo, the boy's small, rigid body seeming even more fragile in his arms. Max, with a sharp bark of despair, tried to lick Daniel's face, who lay inert on the cold ground of the track. "Calm down, boy, calm down," the man murmured to Max, his voice deep and calm as he knelt beside Daniel. He checked Daniel's pulse, then lifted him with unexpected strength, dragging him into the cabin. Max followed them closely, a constant sound of concern in his chest. The cabin was small, rustic, but exuded a welcoming warmth that contrasted brutally with the biting cold of the forest. A fireplace crackled softly in the corner, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. The man carefully laid Daniel on an old sofa covered with a wool blanket, then turned his attention to Leo. "The boy is freezing cold," he said, more to himself than to the dog that watched him with anxious eyes. He took Leo near the fireplace, sitting in a rocking chair and cradling the child in his arms. With experienced hands, he began to rub Leo's arms and legs, trying to restore circulation. "We need to warm him up, and fast." Max approached, sniffing Leo with a soft whine, as if wanting to help. The man looked at him, a glimmer of understanding in his tired eyes. "You're a good dog. You saved them. Didn't you?" As the warmth of the fireplace began to penetrate Leo's clothes, the man took a thick blanket from a nearby chest and carefully wrapped it around the boy. He continued to speak in a low voice, an attempt to calm not only himself, but also the dog and perhaps Leo himself. "My name is Elias. I've lived here for years. I've never seen anyone appear on this trail in the middle of the night. What the hell happened?" Daniel began to groan, a faint sound that brought Max immediately to his side. The dog licked his face again, and Daniel slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the flickering light of the fireplace. His head throbbed, his body ached in every muscle, but the first word he managed to form was, "Leo." Elias turned, still holding Leo. "He's here, son. He's safe, but he's very cold and he doesn't seem to be responding." Daniel tried to get up, but his muscles protested violently. He's autistic. He had a sensory overload and the cold. He needs a doctor. We need a hospital." Elias sighed, shaking his head. My pickup truck has engine trouble, and there's no cell signal here. The nearest town is about a 2-hour drive, if the road is good." He pointed to an old landline phone on the wall. "The line's been dead for weeks. A storm took down the wiring." Daniel's despair returned in full force. They were safe from the immediate cold, but still isolated, with Leo in a critical state. "No, it can't be. There has to be a way." "There's an emergency radio in my pickup truck," Elias said, "but the battery is weak. I was trying to fix the engine to go get a new one. I can try to turn it on, but I don't guarantee anything." Daniel felt a flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame. "Please try, please." Elias nodded, carefully handing Leo to Daniel, who clutched him against his chest. Feeling the faint warmth Elias had managed to infuse, the boy was still motionless, his eyes open and fixed, but now there was a slight flush in his cheeks. Max nestled at Daniel's feet, watching Leo with silent devotion. Elias grabbed a toolbox and went out into the cold night, leaving Daniel alone with Leo and Max. The cabin's silence was broken only by the crackling of the fireplace and Leo's shallow breathing. Daniel stroked his son's hair, whispering words of comfort that he wasn't sure Leo could hear. "You'll be okay, my love," he promised, his voice choked. "We'll get through this, together." The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Daniel felt the warmth of the fireplace, but the cold in his heart persisted. The image of the burning house, the panic, the desperate escape, it all came back in flashes. He had come so close, only to find himself in another dead end. Suddenly, a metallic sound came from outside. Elias was back, his face etched with worry. "I managed to turn on the radio. The battery is almost dead. But maybe there's enough for a quick message, but the frequency is very bad. I can only hear static." Daniel felt the floor give way again. "No, it can't be." "I'll try again," Elias said with grim determination. "I'll try until the battery dies. You stay here. Take care of the boy. He needs you." Elias returned to the pickup truck, leaving Daniel with the terrible feeling that even after everything they had been through, Leo's fate still hung by a tenuous thread, at the mercy of a weak battery and an unstable radio frequency in the middle of nowhere. Hope was a luxury he could barely afford, but the alternative was unthinkable. He had to believe. He had to fight. For Leo, for Max, for himself. Indeed, the outcome of the situation brought a resolution. The threat was contained, and the characters involved found a path to safety and tranquility. The story concludes with order re-established and a sense of calm, allowing a new beginning for everyone. Understood. The story's outcome brought a resolution to the conflicts. The characters involved found a path to safety and tranquility, and the situation calmed, allowing a peaceful new beginning. He had to believe. He had to fight for Leo, for Max, for himself. "I managed to turn on the radio, but no. It can't be. He needs you." He had to believe. He had to fight. For Leo, for Max, for himself. Outside, Elias fought against time and technology. Daniel could hear the intermittent static of the radio, mixed with the old man's deep voice, who was desperately trying to make himself heard. Each pause, each silence, was a stab in Daniel's chest. He pressed Leo against him, feeling his son's warmth, but the boy's immobility was a constant reminder of the urgency. Max, with his muzzle resting on Daniel's knee, looked at Leo with an almost human intensity, as if he too understood the gravity of the situation. Suddenly, the radio's static changed. A clearer sound, though still faint, reached Daniel's ears. He held his breath. Elias was speaking, his voice now louder, more urgent. "Emergency, I repeat, emergency. Child in critical condition, hypothermia, isolated on the Carvalho Trail. We need help, please." There was a tense pause, and then, to Daniel's astonishment and overwhelming relief, a distant voice responded, cutting through the static. "This is the Forest Ranger. We received your call. Can you repeat the coordinates? The signal is very weak." Elias repeated, with a clarity Daniel didn't think possible. Carvalho Trail, Elias's cabin, about 30 kilometers from the main road. Autistic child in shock, needs urgent medical attention. Understood, the voice replied, a little stronger now. We're dispatching a rescue team and an ambulance. Stay on the line if you can. What's your name? Elias, the old man replied, his voice choked with relief. Elias. Daniel collapsed against the sofa, tears streaming down his face. They had made it. Help was on the way. Max, sensing the change in Daniel's tension, let out a soft whine and licked his hand. Elias entered the cabin, his face pale but a tired smile on his lips. They're coming. It'll take some time, but they're coming. The hours that followed were a mix of agonizing wait and growing relief. Elias, with his calm and experience, prepared hot tea for Daniel and made him eat some bread, while Max nestled near Leo like a silent guardian. The warmth of the fireplace felt more comforting now, and the cabin's silence, once oppressive, became a balm. Finally, the distant sound of an engine approached, not Elias's pickup truck, but a more powerful one, followed by flashing lights that tore through the darkness of the night. Daniel ran outside, Leo still in his arms, Max by his side. A rescue team, composed of 2 paramedics and a forest ranger, emerged from a robust vehicle. "Here!" Daniel cried out, his voice hoarse with emotion. The paramedics acted quickly, assessing Leo with professionalism. Severe hypothermia and signs of sensory overload. We need to get him to the hospital immediately. As Leo was carefully placed on a stretcher and taken to the ambulance, Daniel turned to Elias, his eyes welling up. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my son. You saved us." Elias smiled, a gentle glint in his tired eyes. "I just did what anyone would do. I'm glad you're okay." Daniel, exhausted but light-hearted, got into the ambulance beside Leo. Max, with a soft bark, was invited in too, settling at Daniel's feet. As the ambulance drove away, Daniel looked back, seeing Elias wave from the door of his cabin, a beacon of hope in the vastness of the forest. At the hospital, Leo received the necessary treatment. Recovery was slow but steady. Daniel didn't leave his son's side, observing every small sign of improvement. Days later, Leo opened his eyes and, for the first time since the fire, looked at Daniel with a glimmer of recognition. He reached out his small hand, and Daniel held it, feeling a warmth that went far beyond the physical. Max, who had been a constant and comforting presence, laid his head on Leo's bed, letting out a satisfied sigh. The therapy dog, who had been the catalyst of the crisis and the guide to salvation, was now the symbol of healing. The country house had been lost, but Daniel had found something much more valuable, the certainty that his son's life was his greatest treasure, and that love, resilience, and unexpected help could overcome any adversity. Months later, Daniel and Leo, accompanied by Max, were in a new home, simpler, but full of light and hope. Leo was progressing, and although the scars of trauma remained, he was learning to cope with them, with Daniel's help and Max's constant reassuring presence. Daniel looked at Leo, who was playing peacefully in the garden with Max, a genuine smile on his face. Life had given them a second chance, and they would embrace it with gratitude. The forest, the fire, the cold, it had all been a test, a reminder of life's fragility, but also of the unwavering strength of the human spirit and unconditional love. Order had been re-established, and a new beginning, peaceful and full of promises, had finally arrived.